Hello, and thank you for joining us for this virtual fireside chat. My name is Osama Dorias. I'm a game designer at WB Games in Montreal, and I'm really excited to introduce you to a titan, a true legend in our industry, Charles Cecil. So thank you very much for joining us, Charles. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much. What a generous introduction. I'm in the UK, so we're 8 hours ahead. And it's great. And the sun is out, or the sun was out, and it's lovely. And it's a great pleasure to be speaking to you. So thank you.
We're really sorry to have you. I'm sorry. I'm really happy to have you. I actually was really sorry to hear that you had some trouble getting here, is what I meant to say.
Oh,
And it makes
I
it
was
more fun.
stranded. I was stranded on a train. And I was beginning to panic. But anyway, it all worked out fine. The thing about the UK is we don't have a great train system. Unlike Canada, where you're absolutely used to snow and winds and things. I'm afraid we always run. If there's any sort of difficulty in winds or snow or anything, everything grinds to a halt. So I mean, that's just the way it works.
Yeah, we actually, our snow gets really bad here and our cold gets really bad here in Montreal. So we actually built an underground city so we could escape from it all. And our subway system
So
works
cool.
pretty well.
That's so cool.
What
Yeah.
was the last time you came to Montreal?
I've never been to Montreal. I've been to I've been to middle by
Toronto? Toronto,
Toronto.
there you go.
Sorry, being so stupid there. Toronto or Toronto, as
Yeah,
it's
Toronto,
known by the
exactly.
locals.
Yeah.
And I gathered when I was over there that it used to be called York before the name was changed. So the little city of York, which is where I'm from, has had its name has been plastered all over the world.
That's it. Yeah. New York is probably the most famous other York,
Yes,
right?
yes. I know. When I'm in New York, this is not. I won't go on because I know this is not what we're going to be talking about. But when I go to New York, people say, "Yeah, where are you from?" I say, "York," and I expect them to say, "Wow, is that the original?" And they don't even blink. They don't even blink. And I went, "Why? Do you not realise the irony of that? This is York and Old York and original York and New York." But no, none of that. None of
I
that.
guess New York has become its own thing for so long that people don't even
Exactly.
see the association. Well, the next time you're in Montreal, hit me up. And poutine is on me. I don't know if you've ever had poutine before, but it's to die for. And I'll take you out for a nice one.
Wow.
I know all the best spots.
Fantastic.
So yeah,
Thank you.
We have to get started with the fire chat though, because we only have an hour. That's actually a funny thing because we had a couple of chats leading up to this, to just talk a bit and see what topics we wanted to bring up. And then I remember asking you about, would you want to talk about this or that or this? And you would nod in agreement and say, yeah, I want to talk about all these things. But Osama, we don't have 3 hours. So that's actually true. We only have an hour. So I guess it's best to get started. I'd like to start to ask you how you got started in this adventure of making games.
Wow. Do you know what? I started writing games in 1981. So over 40 years ago. And what a privilege and how lucky I am. When I left school, I had just left school. So I was kind of about as young as you could be. Unless you had school kids, which some people did. I mean, some programmers were still at school. But in the UK and some parts of Europe, Sir Clive Sinclair created a computer called the ZX81, which had 1K of memory. And a generation of kids just found this so exciting. Not least because the ZX81, and I love saying this, with its tiny memory by today's standards, had the same processing power and the same memory as the multi-million-dollar computers that landed Apollo 11 on the moon. And that was just so cool. And I was sponsored to become an engineer. I was a graduate trainee or an undergraduate trainee working for Ford. And in those days, the car industry in the UK was just in a terrible state. And frankly, it was all a bit depressing. And I met a friend, I became friends with somebody. We used to play Space Invaders and oh God, that was, this is first time round. And then Galaxians, incredible. And he said to me, I've just started a games company. I'm writing home computer games in Hull, which is a fine city on the east coast of England. He said, why don't you come up and take a look? And I was just blown away. There was they had a TRS-80, which had so much memory and such a cool keyboard compared to what we had. And we played some Scott Adams adventures and various other, and it just was amazing. And then he said, you tell stories, why don't you write an adventure game? I thought, okay, I'll give that a go. And I thought, what should I write the adventure game about? I've just watched Indiana Jones. I know, I'll write one about Indiana Jones. So, the 19 or 18-year-old me sat down and wrote a pretty, I think it's pretty bad, but it was a start. And the thing that I love is that when I go onto eBay now, there are so many of these games. So it did sell well at the time. And it was just really fun. And what a privilege and how lucky I am. And I've been writing adventure games ever since.
That's incredible. I mean, adventure games are like really dear to me. I've played so many throughout my years. What are some of the favorite ones that you've worked on, if you don't mind me jumping to that question right away?
Well, I wrote the first game. In fact, I'm going to show you.
Oh,
right here.
That's a rare treat.
That is it.
Wow.
Isn't that dreadful? Absolutely dreadful.
I love the logo.
The logo is so inappropriate, isn't it? I drew that. Why? What was I thinking? But we were making it up. Osama, we were making it up as we went along. We had no idea. But
you set the standards, though. That says a lot.
They're easy standards to build on. One has to say. They're pretty.
You're too humble. You're too humble.
But then I worked for a bit for this company Arctic, which had Richard Turner had invited me, and then the British games industry absolutely was, it was a golden age for about 2 or 3 years. And there was some fantastic. I'll tell you something else that I was quite proud of. Sorry, I should be better prepared, shouldn't I?
You seem pretty prepared to me. Everything's within arm's reach.
There. That is a chess program that plays a decent game of chess in 1K. Now that is phenomenal, isn't it?
That is incredible.
It is incredible. I just don't know. I mean, I wish I could take any credit. I can't. Because it was this amazing program called David Horn, actually. He wrote this chess program. We kind of just took it for granted that you could play chess in 1K. So this generation of incredible programmers, of which I am not one, emerged from these extraordinary constraints, and we had a real golden age. But the American programmers had 64K. They had so much memory, and they had floppy disk drives, and we had cassettes. And so once the Commodore 64 landed in the UK, so many people went for that because it was so much cooler. And then the American games came in, companies like Activision came in, then Electronic Arts. And we were so naive, and the whole thing kind of got swept away. Then Nintendo, of course, came in with their SNES, and then the SNES. And for a period, everything was dominated by the Americans and the Japanese. And then we had another golden era just a few years later. I was working for a company called US Gold that imported US games and translated them, and I was doing some work converting them. And then Activision. And then in 1990, I was working for Activision, and Activision kind of went bankrupt. This was the version before. This was the Activision before this Activision. Mm-hmm. I'd really wanted to get back into development. And my boss called me in one day, and he said, "Look, I'm really sorry. We're going to have to ask you to just work for 2 days a week. Can you do that?" And I went, "This is absolute." I didn't say this in my head. It was like, this is absolutely perfect. I can keep working for Activision. I was reasonably well paid for 2 days a week, and I can set up my new company. And so that's how Revolution. We had no money at all, and
indirectly funded by Activision.
Independent, and they actually got rather cross when they found out. And I said,
they didn't have a non-compete
for 2 days a week. But the objective really at this new company Revolution was to write adventure games. So my experience of writing adventure games really was the text, the 16K text, and then going into the ST and Amiga era, where we had 64 colors, 320, 200 resolution. And obviously it was very pixelated, but it was an incredible skill to every pixel, when you only got, I think it was 32 colors on the Atari ST. When you got 32 colors, every color is vitally important. And it created a really strong style that a lot of people look back at. I mean, at the time, we desperately wanted, 256 colors and higher resolution. But the feeling and the ambience of those games was very, very much defined by the constraints that we had at that time.
Constraints breed creativity. It allows people to come up with solutions and situations that normally they wouldn't come up with. And like you said, unique art styles and unique visuals. And there are a lot of indies now that try to replicate the visual styles.
Isn't that funny? That's really sweet. I mean, when we basically, I set it up in the city of Hull, which I've mentioned before. And that was because we had no money whatsoever. And the two programmers that I teamed up with, who were founders, were based there. And it seemed more sensible to keep the company there, and I'd drive up and stay with them. And so that's where it all came from. And at Activision, I mean, one of the founders, Noreen, had worked as the product manager for Sierra. And, Sierra were spectacularly successful in the late 80s. And, we loved their adventures. But they took themselves so seriously. Oh, my God. King's Quest. This guy, King Graham. Now, Graham is a fine name, but you're never going to be called King Graham. It doesn't exist. From Daventry. Now, Daventry is next to Luton Airport. It's where when the big planes are coming in, they dump their aero fuel. It's like, this makes no sense whatsoever. So we play these games, and this lunacy would come through. The other thing is, and I really admire Roberta Williams, and that she's just brilliant, and she's defined the genre in many ways. So I'm not criticizing her, but it felt like something had to change. And they were very proud. And Ken Williams, brilliant guy, but something had to change. The puzzles, you would miss something on the first screen. You'd get to the end and you wouldn't know, and it felt like something needed to change. And so what I was excited by was the idea of characters walking around the world, living their own lives. We called it virtual theatre. Can I talk about that? Sorry,
of course, absolutely.
I'm going
Go
off script
for
here,
it.
aren't I?
Virtual theater. I've never heard the term. I'm really curious to know what that.
So we were very, very, very proud of this idea, virtual theatre, which was the idea of characters walking around the world. And you could give commands to them, and they'd go off and do things.
Do they have an AI, or is it just that they have?
I think they had an AI. I think AI in the loosest of terms. Okay. I think if you had an AI company now, and you described this as AI, they would throw their hands up in horror because it was so simple. But it felt clever. Yes. It felt clever at the time. And the only thing I had of real value was a 386 PC, and I loved it so much. And I used to play flight sims on it, and I just loved it. And it was expensive. It had cost, like £2,000, which in those days was an awful lot of money.
Yeah.
And these guys convinced me that they had to develop on it, which they did. So I very, very reluctantly gave it to them. Okay. Wow. And they were in a little fruit shop in Hull because we had no money. And basically, these guys were so mean. They put them upstairs with no heating, and they just sat next to each other, right next to each other like this. And they had the PC, and then the Amiga, and then the ST, and then the monitors, and they worked away like this. And I drove up, and it was so cold. And these guys said, "Look, can we get a heater?" So I said, "Yeah." So I went and bought a gas heater. But the problem was that the gas heater gave off such terrible fumes that they'd have to open the window when the gas heater came on. It's like it was just crazy. Anyway, we worked, and this is the best way when we were young and we were excited, and this is our opportunity, and it was great. And they wrote a brilliant demo. It took about 4 months, and we were due to pitch to a company called Mirasoft that doesn't exist anymore. But funnily enough, it was actually named after the newspaper, the Daily Mirror, that was owned by a gentleman called Robert Maxwell. And he fell off his yacht or was murdered or did something. And he ended up dead. and his yacht was the Lady Ghislaine Maxwell. And that is the Ghislaine story, or Ghislaine. You know Ghislaine Maxwell?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, she's about to turn up in court. She was the daughter of Robert Maxwell, who owned Mirasoft. So there you go.
That is incredible. And that was an adventure in and of itself, huh?
That was, because I mean, that was an adventure, because he was as corrupt as anything. And looking back, no one's quite sure whether, some people think the Israeli Secret Service boarded the boat and killed him. Other people think that he committed suicide. Maybe it was a bit of both. He'd been cheating the pension fund. He'd been taking money out of the pension fund. Anyway, but before all of this, we were doing the pitch. They were just a great, and a friend of mine, Sean Brennan, was the deputy managing director there, deputy CEO. And anyway, I told these guys, right, we're going to do the pitch, bring the PC down, but make sure that nothing bad happens to it. Strap it up in the back seat, okay? And they went, you really want us to strap? And I went, yes, I really want you to strap that PC up.
It's your baby, of course.
It's my baby. And also, we hadn't backed anything up. So, it was really important that it didn't crash, because, so anyway, they come down to London, and they bring their stuff in, and we have a glass of wine and another glass of wine and cook some food and plan, and then drink a bit more wine and having a good old time. And the next morning, I remember getting up, looking out of the window. And in those days, people used to smash the side windows to steal the car radios. It happened all the time. And I looked out, and somebody had smashed the window. And I went, oh, God. And then suddenly I realized we'd forgotten to bring the PC in. It had been left strapped into the back of the car. This thing, like the radio was only worth like 20, 30 pounds.
Yeah.
This PC was worth thousands of pounds.
Oh my God.
And it had everything, like with no backup. And as you can imagine, I absolutely went crazy. And I ran out, opened the door, and it was just still sitting there, as happy as anything. this idiot thief had stolen the car radio, but left the PC behind. It was insane.
He had no idea what it was.
Had they taken it, that would have been the end of revolution. There would be no revolution. So we've had a lot of serendipity, and it was just a great presentation. It was a great presentation because it was new ideas. And one of the things that I have learned is that we first of all, adventure developers, we have the most wonderful community. They love innovation, and I've been lucky enough to be able to communicate directly with our community, so they know that if I say something, then it's true. It's true. I mean, it might change, but it's not bullshit. It's and so I've hugely valued the the relationship that we've had and the ability to talk honestly to people.
That's great. Sorry, you stopped as I was taking a sip. The timing. So you mentioned that it was a really good pitch. I'm curious how pitching adventure games to publishers has evolved throughout your career. How is it different back then? Is it different now? In between.
What a good question. Obviously, we had very little memory. We had 16K.
Yeah.
We had, as I said, 32 colors. So we were very constrained. And that is, as you said, that is fantastically helpful, because it means that the technology is pretty much locked into place. And if you've got a great artist, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but if you've got a great artist and nice ideas, then actually you really can do anything, and you can do it fairly quickly. So it's really wonderful and creative. And we're very lucky because in Hull, we needed a writer and to write the dialogue. I'm very jealous about the stories and the puzzles, but I don't write dialogue. And at Activision, there'd been a tester who was older than I was. So, he seemed very old, but his test reports were beautifully written. I mean, just better than he wrote a report on an adventure, and his test report on the adventure was so much better written than the adventure itself. So he was called Dave Cummins. So I brought him up to Hull with me, and that was great. And he was terrific. A local lad who was working for a company called Kalamazoo as a clerk, had a passion for animation. So he came in, and I mean, he seemed pretty good, so we employed him. Actually, in hindsight, he was absolutely brilliant. I mean, just brilliant. Steve Oates, big shout out for Steve Oates. And then the final member, apart from the two founders, the two programming founders, Tony Warner and Dave Sykes, was a guy called Adam Tween that sent something through the post. And, you know, at the time, you just assume that this is what everybody's like. But we were just so lucky that these talented people all happened to be around and come together at the same time. And, you know, I was very much blessed with that.
It's a completely different world right now. I mean, there are many job postings open and a lot of competition to get them, and portfolios that are online that are getting reviewed. And back then, it was people figuring out how to do the thing pretty much on the job, and you having to assess potential. It's very, very different.
Indeed, but then, as we keep saying, the constraints were such that actually there wasn't that much you could do. And if you know, if you're a pixel artist, and it's the same now, but as a pixel artist, you know, if you only have 16 colors, you really, we worked with Dave Gibbons, the wonderful Dave Gibbons, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment, but Absolutely. He described it as like jury making, because, you know, the way the colors all fed together and everything was just really, really important.
That's incredible. So you worked with, what project did you work with Dave Gibbons on?
Oh, well, that takes me on to the second question. You know, it's almost like we rehearsed this, isn't it?
Almost like we've had this conversation before, or a similar one.
So our first game was called Lure of the Temptress. So I'll come on to Dave in a minute. Yes. And one of the things that I felt very passionately when founding Revolution is that the way that women were being depicted in video games was, I mean, it was frankly, it was disgusting. You know, it was like strip poker, and I mean, people have views now, but it was shocking. It was really shocking. And so we decided that just because, you know, it would make a better story to have strong female protagonists, because like it would be just, as I say, it would be a better story. So it's slightly ironic that our first game was called Lure of the Temptress, which does kind of smack of, you know, slightly objectifying, you know, this particular woman. But in my defense, I remember we wrote this game. It was coming along really well. It was looking really nice. And the head of marketing at Microsoft is a woman called Alison Beasley. And Alison, I remember her phoning me up one day and said, like, "I've got to come up with a really good name for this. Can you make some suggestions?" So I came up with a lot. I'm sure most of them were crappy. And then at the bottom, I wrote Lure of the Temptress. Why, I don't know. And I put in brackets, "This is a joke." And she came back and she said, "We love Lure of the Temptress. Can we call it that?" And I said, "Alison, I would, but there are two problems. One, we have no luring, and two, we have no temptress." And I swear to God, there was a silence, and she said, "Can you put one in?" Oh my God.
But it's funny how that happens. I mean, we learned the lesson pretty young. Don't a lot of times we pitch two things we like and one thing we don't like, just so, you know, we make their choice easier. And oftentimes they pick the thing that we don't want. So we learned really quickly, okay, maybe don't do that anymore. But you were young back then, and I guess that was something
and you do learn. And, you know, Absolutely. Good marketing people are brilliant. Yes. Good marketing people are brilliant. And Alison is brilliant. But, you know, I think it's called expectation management, isn't it? It's just like, you know, you as we get older, we do realize that we have different roles, and, you know, they'll take something, they'll get excited and they'll run with it. But if you give them the wrong thing to get excited by, they will run with the wrong thing. It's just the way the world works.
Absolutely. So Dave worked on Lure of the Temptress with you?
No. So let's go back to Activision.
Yes.
Dave had just written a comic book called Watchmen he'd drawn a comic book called Watchmen with Alan Moore. Yes,
which I have back there somewhere.
Oh, fantastic.
There you go.
Oh, nice.
Dave's art right here.
Yeah. I was with Dave. I was with Dave in Times Square at New York Comic Con, the one maybe a year and a half ago. And we were just walking through Times Square, and I was so proud on his behalf, because everywhere you looked, there were those big electronic, you know, advertising, you know, and they all had his artwork on. And I thought, good on you. Anyway, that was 2 years ago rather than 25 years ago. So we wrote. Sorry, at Activision, I thought it'd be great to get the rights to produce a video game. So I phoned him up, and he was really friendly. But he said, "Look, I don't have the rights. I think it was Dark Horse that had it, and then it went to Warner Brothers or whoever." So we kind of kept in touch, and it was a real privilege to be in touch with Dave. And so when we wrote our second game, it was kind of dystopian. It's just Beneath the Steel Sky. It was dystopian and gritty, and it felt like Dave might be, a good person. So I phoned him up, expecting him to turn me down. And there are so many cool people that I've come across who work in other industries who love the idea of video games, and he was one of them. Because if you think about it from an intellectual perspective, the idea of a narrative being interactive is completely radical. You go from 2,000 or 1,000 years ago when plays were written, and then paintings and sculptures which tell stories, and theatre, and then the novel, and then television, and then film. So to come up with something where actually it's interactive offers the most extraordinary opportunities. And bright people see this, and I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of bright people who get really excited by the potential, and Dave was very much one of them. So I phoned him up, and he said I'd love to. Now the problem is that Hull, as I say, is a great city, but back in those days, you got the fast train to a place called Doncaster, which, funnily enough, is where I was stuck 3 hours ago, worried I was going to miss this, and then you get these terrible trains. What the British government had commissioned was things called sprinters, which is really a euphemism, because they'd gone to our bus company, British Leyland, and asked them to produce cheap trains. So they just got buses and put train wheels on them, and this is what these things were. I mean, just a disaster. Anyway, so poor old Dave would come up, and I thought the first time he'd come up, he was going to never want to come up again. But the secret was that, again, we had no money. So we were in a very cheap office above a fruit machine arcade, one-armed bandits, I don't know what, but anyway, betting. And it was full of smoky, lots of young women in particular in the middle of the day, smoking cigarettes, pushing prams. And at the end, there was a counter that served bacon butties. Now, a butty is like a bap. Do you know what I mean by bap? Like,
no, can you define?
It's like
I don't
bread.
know what
It's
either
a soft piece of bread.
Okay.
Which is so soft that it gets stuck in the roof of your mouth. It's really bad for you. Thick, greasy bits of bacon. Really, and if you're feeling really, you put some chips on there as well. So bacon, chips, and a really thick bit of bread. It was delicious. And I discovered that actually Dave would put up with everything, because he'd know at the end of the journey there was a bacon butty waiting for him. But Dave was great, because originally we asked him to come in and just draw the backgrounds, which he did, and then he got really excited, as I said, by just the idea of pixels and pixel art. And Steve Oates trained him up, and we gave him an Amiga and Deluxe Paint 2. And he started producing these things himself. And then he sort of asked, obviously, to draw the background, he needed to know about the gameplay. He didn't ever want to contribute to the gameplay, but he wanted to understand the gameplay.
Of course.
And then because of that, he wanted to know about the story. And he's very smart, no surprise there, and was able to really contribute. I was driving the story, driving the design, working with Dave in particular, Dave Cummins, and once a month, Dave Gibbons would turn up, and it was a pleasure to see him. And he would contribute just new ideas that from a different dimension. It was really, really good, and it was a pleasure to work with him.
How did you find his transition from working in comic books to video games? Did he adapt to the limitations quickly? I find actually that's one of the hardest things I find when working with people who work in other mediums, even brilliant people, really smart people, is at the beginning there's growing pains. They adapt, but there are growing pains to try to make them understand what is easy for us and what is hard for us. Like just those little nuances. Like I won't name the game, because then you could figure out who I'm talking about, and I don't want to. But a very famous writer who wrote something very big once worked with us on a project, and would limit himself in a way that actually made it very hard for us to make the game. He would make a lot of talky bits and very few helicopter and car explosions and chases. And we tried to explain that the helicopter and the car were modeled. The explosions already work. That's actually cheap for us. The talky bits, we have to get the voice actors back in the room and pay them. And that's actually the longer bit. And we have to have like the cinematics and that kind of thing. So that back and forth, it was really hard. Like we had to explain it for every individual type of media, type of content before it came to be. Did you have similar struggles? Because I mean, the comic medium is also kind of limited, so I guess there's
but what Dave said is, he said, you are the experts in this. That's the other thing. You know, he was smart enough to see what he could contribute to, which was very broad. I mean, one of the things, Simon, I think this is a really interesting point, that you know, if you look at Peter Jackson with the big project that he was going to, you look at Steven Spielberg and the project that he was going to do with EA.
Yes.
They've almost all gone wrong.
Yeah.
And the reason that they've gone wrong is for exactly the reason that you're saying, that the thing about writing interactively and for games is it is a different skill set. And I would say that Steven Spielberg thinking that he can write, you know, a great game design is a bit like me saying I can write a great script. It's nonsense, because we haven't been trained to do it, and we don't. And you know, there's certain key constraints, and I mean, there are huge opportunities, and they probably are shared across film. But you know, one of the reasons that it was so great to work with Dave is that when you have if you have any story, particularly in film, you have this concept of an inciting incident, and the inciting incident is where the life of the protagonist is radically unbalanced. And in a film, it can come at any point. It can come at a third of the way through. You know, I'm thinking of, you know, the wonderful Manchester by the Sea, which is a film I love so much. That probably that inciting incident, which I won't spoil, but it's quite clear when you see why our protagonist is so haunted, you know, came about a third of the way through the film, and everything was leading to that. And what you have, before you have the inciting incident, you have to have built an empathetic relationship with the character, you know, and there's plenty of time to do that. In a video game, because you're expecting the player to start working from the moment the game starts, you need to have created the inciting incident during the cutscene.
Yeah.
And before that, you need to have built up the relationship and the empathetic. And comic books, and I wish I could have said this was planned, but it's not. But comic books, as it happened, are brilliant for that. So in Beneath the Steel Sky, it starts off with a shot looking up, and you know, Foster is a real hero, and he's wearing his, you know, his jacket, and the shaman says, you know, I see evil, and Foster looks up and he says, I don't know about evil, but I heard a chopper. And it's so beautifully drawn, and it's well written by Dave, and it's like, this is great. And in 10 pages, you have told the story, because that's what comics are great at doing.
Yes.
They tell a story incredibly effectively and incredibly dramatically, which is exactly what we needed, because we needed to set the situation up. Now, the reason that there are so many licenses, you know, if you have Harry Potter, the game, Harry Potter, you don't need to create the empathy, because you know who Harry Potter is. Yeah. And that's why licenses work so well. That's why there are so many orcs versus wizards, because or Starship Troopers. You know, everybody knows that if you have a Starship Trooper, you kind of don't need to explain, you know. Yes. And that's why we use these tropes. And
exactly. But the people who had to create the tropes before us, they had a lot of work to do. Like that's actually, yeah, that's why Tolkien.
They came from film. They all came from film, because they have the opportunity to create this, and we just shortcut it. And a lot of people say, "Oh God, video game stories are so bad," but unless you understand what the constraints are and how you can make the most of it, then somebody coming in who doesn't have the skills is just going to make the same mistakes. I mean, they just are.
Absolutely. Yeah, we really have to take a step back and understand what the medium is good at, what's easy to do in the medium, what's hard, and not just in like storytelling is a big part of that, but in other things too. Like if you want to blow up a planet in a comic book, that's one panel that you draw. If you want to blow up a planet in a video game, first you have to model that planet, then you have to create the explosion, and then you're never going to see it again. So you have to justify doing that. It's a lot more work for the same thing. Same thing with dialogue scenes in comic books versus dialogue scenes in video games versus movies. In movies, you just ask the actors. It's still effort, it's work, but you ask the actors to stay on for another scene and record a couple of lines. For a comic book, that's real estate, and that you can't really. It affects your pacing in a very different way. If you don't understand these limitations, then if you're just trying to transcribe one kind of story to another medium without adapting it, you're going to fall short one way or the other. Regardless of which way you go, you're going to fall short. So it's really interesting.
Tell us who it was. Go on, Sam. Go on.
I cannot. I mean, I have to. It's been a long time, so it's no one recent. I'll tell you that. But still, it's a little bit of an embarrassing story. Maybe one day. If I write a book.
Over a beer.
I'll have a Coke, but yes, I will definitely join you for drinks.
Good.
Okay. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about as well, you jumped headfirst into the adventure genre because this was what was possible to make at the time, and you had an aptitude for storytelling, and then you just continued going this route. During your long, illustrious career, have you ever at any point thought of working on a different kind of genre? I'm curious if that ever came up.
No, because I think it's really difficult writing any genre, and people become incredibly skillful in that one genre. I daren't say it. Dare I say it? I think it's rather arrogant. I think it'd be rather arrogant of me to think that I could write a different genre, because you have incredibly skillful people.
So I respectfully disagree, because I'm sure your talent would translate extremely well. But I see where you're coming from. There would be a little bit of growing pains to transition.
But also, my team, my team is not. It's not their skill set necessarily either. But no. So and I mean, the other thing, of course, is that the adventure as a genre is extraordinarily wide now. I mean, it's a really exciting genre. I was really enjoying What Remains of Edith Finch. I mean, admittedly,
it's one of my favorite
games. Year ago. Isn't it great?
It's one of my favorite games.
And that fish cutting head bit where all these things come off, we remember it. And the thing is that people remember Lure of the Temptress, the story of it, and it was 30 years ago. People don't remember films that well. That is the strength that we have.
Yes.
Obra Dinn is great. I love Untitled Goose Game, which I'm gonna claim that as an adventure.
I know I've shown it to you before, but I have somewhere here The Return of the Obra Dinn book. This is actually the game in book form, which means there are spoilers here, which means I'm not going to show it right now.
I love that game. I love that game.
So brilliantly done. Absolutely.
And isn't it fantastic being able to tell it? And obviously the term adventure is a very loose one.
Yeah.
And people confuse adventure with action adventure.
Yeah.
And if you're talking about action adventure, then you've got Tomb Raider, and Assassin's Creed and games like that, which clearly are quite different.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about that more. I mean, right now we have a lot of indies who are looking for their next project. That's always happened. It's always they're looking into the past to see what they could either resurrect, or they're looking into what they think the future holds. What advice would you give to an indie right now who wants to make an adventure game?
Well, what I would say is that point and click is so much work, and we're very lucky with Broken Sword because we have a really loyal fan base, and I really love writing these games. You look at a game like, say, Inside, and which is a magnificent game, and I would claim that as one of our own as well. I'm going to claim that as an adventure because, well, kinda. Because the story emerges from the gameplay, and I think at its heart, that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to define an adventure as the gameplay emerging. Sorry, the story emerging from the gameplay. So, if you look at an RPG, the RPG is a repeated gameplay of going around, exploring and killing people generally and collecting gold, and that's fine. But that's not an adventure, because the adventure, it doesn't integrate the story with the gameplay, you know. And there's so much innovation. I mean, I think the Return of the Obra Dinn is fantastic, and you know, we both very, very much admire Lucas Pope for just coming up with, you know, particularly after Papers, Please.
Yes.
Which itself was a magnificent game. And the point about Papers, Please is that obviously it was deliberately written to be Soviet-esque and very simple. But dare I say that, you know, Papers, Please is 90% ideas, 90% the talent of this story that is emerging from the papers that are being presented, and could be written by anybody, really. You know, the complexity is not in the programming or the art; it's in the concept. So, you know, to answer your question directly, it's look at the amazing wealth of the genre. Look at all the awards that these games win. They do win awards. I mean, adventures are often, you know, the darlings, and come up with some. Look at you know, Her Story. You know, Her Story again could be, it's ideas and adventures. You know, if you want to write an adventure, look at the most interesting ideas that can be conveyed in the most simplistic way. One, you innovate, and two, you'll be able to afford to finish it. I mean, I love doing point and click, and that's great, but they're expensive and they're big and they take a huge amount of work.
It's that elegance of being able to take so few moving parts and to tell such a powerful story. Have you seen the recent game that came out called Unpacking?
Do you know, I think I must be the only person in the world that hasn't played Unpacking.
Let me tell you a little bit about it. It is wonderful. And the game, the entire mechanics of the game is that you have rooms and you have these boxes. You open the boxes and you have items and you're unpacking. You're putting them away. That's the story. And then you move forward 5 years in your life and you're moving into a bigger house, a bigger apartment, a different house with someone else. That's all it is. But the story that unfolds, like I'm gonna try not to spoil it, but the story that unfolds just through these very simple mechanics is surprising and powerful, because you don't see it coming. You don't even know you're being told the story of this person's life as they move on from house to house. And all you're seeing is what they choose to bring with them and what the house is and who they're moving with. But you know this person's life from it, and the heartaches that come with it, and the happiness and the joy from this very simple mechanic. I would absolutely consider this an adventure game as well, in theme. And it's incredible. It's incredible that all the examples that you gave are that. They're just incredibly elegant games with very few moving parts and a lot of heart, a lot of story. It's beautiful. So that's the future of adventure games, right?
Well,
I mean, you solved it.
plenty of space for the point and click adventures as well.
Yes.
Or the game that we wrote most recently with Dave Gibbons, called Beyond the Steel Sky, which was the virtual. Now that's almost like I'm trying to shoehorn this in. I think it was a good transition there. So give me the credit.
You have the credit. It's yours.
But most recently, we took what had been a point and click and moved into a full 3D world.
Yes. And
this was very much on the basis and worked closely with Dave. And sorry, I'm changing the subject, forgive me, but no, just to say, when we'd written the original game, Virgin, who are our publisher, had called it an interactive comic, which was utter and complete nonsense. It was just marketing speak, because there was nothing comic-y about it apart from the comic that accompanied it. But when we, fast forward 25 years to last year, and for the consoles coming out on the at the end of this month, thank you for asking, on coming to a digital or a physical store near you.
It's very exciting.
It was the opportunity to work with Dave back on comic books and really come up with a style which we could do using the technology, Unreal, and our own toon rendering, to create something that kind of felt like an interactive comic book.
Yes.
Sorry, I feel like I've really sidelined you here.
No,
marketing,
No, absolutely. People are here because they want to know what you worked on and what you're working on. So this is absolutely on topic. And it's funny because we actually had one question come up, and we said we'd pull aside a little bit of time at the end for questions, but one of the questions that came up came up as we were answering it is there room in these days for adventure games, and which modern game of genre do you consider the most compelling? And what's interesting is that you just rattled off a whole bunch of games at the same time that this question came up. Are there others that you would consider, people who are working, let's say, for example, in AAA? How could they bring a little bit of sense of that adventure that you tell in their games?
Well, all I would say is, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily right, but our games always attempted to create narrative blocks, puzzles.
Yeah.
But those narrative blocks were always within the context of the world at that time, and the motivations reflected the motivations of those characters. And by doing that, your characters are much more interesting. And one of the things I have learned is that if you try and write for characters that are not ingrained into the actual puzzle structure, it's really difficult to make them interesting.
Yeah.
Because if once they are ingrained into the puzzle structure, then they have a role in the game beyond just the narrative, and the narrative just it writes itself, and it's great. So yeah, as I say, if you can have characters that are drawn into the gameplay itself, they will be much easier to write. That's a really important lesson I've learned through all my time writing adventure games.
That's absolutely a valuable lesson as well, and a weapon in your arsenal, in your craft of making games. The other question that we have right now is, did Gibbons work digitally back then, or was there digital artists that helped translate his more traditional drawing? What was the process involved in him creating art?
Interesting. Everything was done on paper.
Yeah.
And we had fax machines, so
wow.
he could send stuff. We could send stuff backwards and forwards. But no, he drew absolutely everything in paper, and we have a lot of that material still. I mean, more recently, now he does everything digitally. But when he drew his comic book, it was actually colored by somebody in Canada. I don't know the name of this person, and I remember he sent everything off with a massive hard drive, and a massive hard drive came back. So we were beginning to work digitally. Hull was one of the first, I think it was the first place in the UK actually to have modems.
Yeah.
But in those days, the way a modem worked is you'd phone the person up, you'd agree the bit rate. There were about 4 or 5, and then you'd try and get a line, which was not easy, but then you'd get a line, and then you'd find it didn't work. So you'd ring them up and you change the and then it still wouldn't work. And then you just go to the train station and post it down by train, because it's like you just gave up. Yeah. It was so compared to now. I mean, it's obvious to say it's a truism that that it's so easy now to communicate, and obviously, it just makes it so much more efficient. Of course. Not necessarily better, but much more efficient. The communication, and it's a pleasure, but it's we're all beneficiaries of this, and it's extraordinary.
Curious about that. You said not necessarily better. Are there parts of working in the old ways or on old platforms? Yes. What parts do you like? What part do you miss?
Well, I'm gonna take us out of video games, but I would argue that the most natural animators are the ones that learnt on paper. They made all their mistakes on paper. They flick through really fast, and you can see the movement. And there's just an instinct, and that instinct doesn't exist. People who can animate always animate on computers. Obviously, there are many people who are very, very talented, but there's something about working on paper. Also, artists who drew and painted, made mistakes, changed things. They if they then go to digital art, they bring something forward. They're not necessarily better, but there's a skill that doesn't exist, and it's not better or worse, but it's different. And the problem, obviously, with CG is you can get mediocre people who use the computer to paper over the cracks. Yeah. And obviously, when people were drawing on paper, or if they were painting on paper, then there was nowhere to hide. If it wasn't very good, or if they got the perspective wrong, or if they didn't understand the lighting, or all of these things, it jumped out at you. And the problem is that with computers doing a lot of this, you can get some reasonable art, but to have exceptional art, you have to understand. And a lot of that originally came from drawing or animating on paper.
Absolutely. I think that permanence of paper forces people to learn from the mistakes that they did and not repeat them. That gives it a special feeling. I think I don't have that experience. Like when I started working on games, everything was already digital. But we did hire, I cannot remember his name for the life of me, but we hired concept artists when I was working on Dungeon Hunter, who had worked on a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons books, who had worked exclusively in traditional paper when he provided his concepts. And he had a workflow that allowed him to do that, where he would actually work on acetate papers and be able to swap out some parts and others. He didn't want to work in digital. And he said that at the beginning. He's like, I'm not going to do digital. It's not what I enjoy. And I thought at that point in his career, he moved on from it. But he found a way to work the way he always wanted to work and make it work for us, where he'd be like, I'd swap out the wings or I'd swap out the horns. And these are the 4 options that you have where I don't have to redraw the same thing. And there was like you said, it had his different personality to it than whenever you have other concept artists, not necessarily better or worse, just different, the different feel. And that feel is something that it's really hard to replicate when you could just change things on a whim, when you could just adjust it.
Can I give you one other very, very tenable example? And that is that when we were writing the game that we're probably best known for, which is called Broken Sword, I went to a college in Dublin called Ballyfermot, which had been set up to provide the Don Bluth studios with animators and layout people. And I met this very talented Irishman who'd worked at the Don Bluth studios. And he showed me his artwork, his layouts. And what you had to do in those days is obviously the camera would travel across and you would have to change the perspective as the camera changed. So if you look at this thing like this, it makes no sense because the camera is looking straight down. And by the time the camera moves over here, you change the perspective. And if you understand, I mean, basically the rule is that you mustn't have 2 vanishing points. You're always changing the vanishing points. And obviously the vanishing point is completely different. And the rule is as long as the camera doesn't see both vanishing points at the same time, then the eye, and the great thing is that the eye, if you have, it knows, you just know that you're in the hands of somebody who's a brilliant draftsperson. And obviously if you have a camera in 3D, then the camera will rotate. And the difference between a camera rotating and drawing it is night and day. And there's something very pure and something very beautiful about a camera, a real camera being moved across a page and the perspective being changed by somebody who truly understands exactly how to make it look good.
We had a little bit of that back when I worked in mobile games before smartphones. I have to make that distinction because smartphones are very similar to console. We had 3D cameras as well as a possibility where we would have levels which would be created in pixel art in layers with parallax scrolling between, with that same tactic that you're talking about, with the vanishing points that were separate. And that's a skill that people had to learn and pick up. It's not a given. Wanted to change the subject slightly, actually. We're talking about a lot of the content that you created yourself, but you also worked on licensed games. I want to know a little bit about what's the difference, of approach, because you mentioned when you have Harry Potter, then people already know Harry Potter. Well, you worked on Doctor Who. How was that different than creating your own? Did you enjoy the experience?
Well, what I have to say, I mean, I really enjoyed it. It was out of necessity. Okay. When we wrote Broken Sword 3, the model was so rotten for developers, and we worked with a publisher that didn't survive very long after the move to digital distribution, THQ. And this, I'm no criticism of this particular contract because it was a contract that we signed, but we ended up they made about a $5 million profit from the game because it was quite successful. And we ended up making a £200,000 loss, which is about 300,000 US dollars. And it was just crazy. And we were writing games that were successful, and we were losing money. And the publishers around us were making millions and millions and millions of dollars. So on the basis that this is really not a very good way to run a business, we just had to mothball Revolution because we were insolvent. We never went bankrupt. We paid all our debts and came back out at the other end. But it meant that I then took on freelance work, and I really enjoyed that. And if most British kids, loved Doctor Who when they were young, and you can identify, how old somebody is by which Doctor is theirs. Yes. Mine is Tom Baker. Thank you for asking. And so it was quite an honor to be asked to get involved in the Doctor Who project, and it was taken very seriously. The person that I kind of liaised with quite closely was a guy called Stephen Moffat, who was is a brilliant writer. He produced the Sherlock. He wrote the Sherlock, invented the BBC Sherlock, and he's written on many films as well. And it was fascinating to see a different way of approaching storytelling from inside. And I found that extraordinarily stimulating, and I'm quite proud of the games we worked with. We actually contracted it to a company called Sumo Digital in Sheffield, who happened to be quite close to York, which was great, and I enjoyed working with them. The very talented Sean Millard, who was their creative director, and it became a bit of a sort of partnership between the two of us and the BBC, and it was fun. It was, I mean, the one thing as a consultant is that you don't get, ultimately the production is decided by the production company, by the developer. So, my voice was limited to an extent, unless I felt very strongly about something. Yeah. But the BBC, I'll tell you a story. One of the guys who was a bit of an idiot at the BBC said, "Oh, the developers shouldn't get involved with the talent." Now, the
developers are the talent.
Find the word talent extraordinarily patronizing, because it suggests that there are some people with talent and the rest have no talent, which is like, where did that term come from? Anyway, I was clearly not the talent. So we were told we weren't allowed to get involved with the talent. And then this wonderful producer who was just fantastic, called Anwen Aston, a Welsh woman, phoned me up, I remember, one Friday and said, are you free this weekend? I'm really sorry to ask. And I said, no, I am. She said, would you mind directing the person who was playing the Doctor and the person who's playing the companion? And it was just a pleasure to be able to then come into the studio and be at the center of this directing process. And the actors were wonderful. They were really excited by the medium. They were really excited to see their avatars. And it just was a great mixing of two different mediums coming together, I thought.
Absolutely. That was a great story. I mean, I am also working on Gotham Knights, which is a Batman game. And if I could go back in time and talk to 9-year-old me and tell 9-year-old me that one day I will contribute somehow to the Batman story, I would not have believed myself. So I imagine that you'd have, like, maybe video games weren't a thing when you were watching Doctor Who as a kid, but if someone told you would add to the story of Doctor Who, how would you have reacted? That would have been...
Well, but Osama, I mean, you're young. I mean, before about 1988, Batman was Batman and Robin, kapow, really childish, holy mackerel. And then, 1988 comes along. Yeah. And this incredible new generation of Batman, and you're too young for this, I would think, but for my generation, this was just incredible. We'd never seen anything from it, and it all came, of course, from Batman being banned because of the Delinquency Act, where the US decided that, as I'm sure you know, that comic books were leading to teenage delinquency, and so they effectively neutered it. And for a generation, we just saw this neutered Batman. So when the power of that story came back again, it was incredible. And now you're producing games for it. Good for you.
It's incredible. Sometimes I have to pinch myself. I bet you do as well. I mean, we are very fortunate to be working in this industry and creating joy for so many people. It's time. Yeah. We just got the note that we have to close, and I would talk to you.
We got the voice of God, didn't we? We got the voice of God saying,
nobody else heard it.
Guys, you need to get off.
It. So, I mean, I could talk to you for hours. I have so many other talking points, and you're an absolute pleasure. You're a lovely person, Charles, and an absolute pleasure to talk to. So, I want to thank
your side of all of these things, Osama. I feel that, you know,
one day the tables will turn, and you can have a fireside chat where you ask me questions. You know, maybe it'll happen one day.
Where are you going to be next year?
You know what? I'm really hoping to go to GDC in March. I'm really hoping that everything works out.
That'll be great. But I'm saying this time next year, let's ask if we can turn the tables.
You know what? We'll request it.
Yeah.
Well, that's really all the time we have. Thank you, folks, for tuning in. Charles, thank you all again for all your time and all your wonderful stories and answers.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And yeah, that's it. Have a very good day. Thank you very much.